Now that you've taken a look at Kelly Benoit Bird's presentation, well, keep in mind that's 6.5 minutes, so that's about as long as your minimum informative speech link would be for this particular class, and that's sort of a very standard form time limit for presenting an idea quickly. What I've got here is my flow. I went ahead and typed it up off of my handwritten flow, and you can see I've got further annotations off of that. I've got my flow, I've got my notes, I've got my feedback form, and then also at the end of this video you'll see my revision of her outline. So I'm going to kind of move through it in this regard, in this order here. So let's go ahead and start with the flow, and I've got a few comments here, and then we'll move into some more general comments. So at the very beginning of that, we start off with the opening. That's fine. The ocean is an alien world. It's unknown and it's dark. And then she jumps immediately into using sound to study krill. I'll come back to this, but my initial question is, we're spending a lot of time on, in essence, what's a methodology point, how she studies krill. But really, the talk's not about how she studies krill, but about food aggregation. The sound there is important, but we're spending a lot of time, almost a minute of this 6-minute speech, talking about how she gets these results. So, we're rolling right out of that introduction into the methodology point, almost to the point where you're a good 3 minutes in, 2.5, 3 minutes in, before you really kind of know what the talk's actually about. You could have very easily been forgiven for thinking that this was going to be a talk on using sound waves to study marine life, because it's not previewed at the outset what she's going to be talking about. All right, then she goes into this discussion of there's not a lot of food in the ocean. She's got some statistics on that, some numbers on that, and then she's got that popcorn analogy, which I think is very useful and a good analogy. As I'll say later on, I think she can actually kind of return to that analogy later on, and that would be very helpful. Then she gets into her research. She talks a little bit about the background on her research, talks about why krill are important, talks about her first map of krill density, and then she has a really good explanation of this problematic result, where we see high food areas, the animal population is hurting, but where we see low areas, it's actually doing well. So she has some good discussion around that, and then she turns to the second map of krill clumps. And she says, so, it's not the number of krill, but how they're clumped. That's a great way to end that point, although I got a key question here that I don't think is ever actually answered, which is why? How does clumping make krill better for that animal population? I know that krill is that clumping aggregation is important for animal survival, but I'm not sure why that is. That seems like an excellent place to me to return to that popcorn analogy that she had earlier on as a way of explaining why clumping aggregation is so important. Then she's got what I would assume is her last point, which is animals can tell us what's important. And then she's got this point about sort of when plants aggregate, it aggregates all the way up the food chain, and this allows us to predict survival. That section for me, where she's first doing that graphic with the layer of plants, is probably the most unclear part of the speech. She just moves so quickly through that pretty dense stuff, and she gets pretty jargony right there. But then she's got a much longer section where she's going through the second aspect of that evidence, that Hawaii research example, and talking about how dolphins themselves are aggregating food sources. And then she ends with this line that I got to tell you, I think should have come absolutely at the top of the speech, or at least near the beginning, which is the cell sentence, the bumper sticker of this short presentation. Aggregation is critical to survival. She says that at the end, but it's almost as if she's been sitting on that line throughout the entire thing. Speech is not a mystery novel. I would love to have that earlier on. So those are some general comments based on my flow. Let me go through some more global ones here as well, under invention, arrangement, style, and delivery. So under invention, you'll see this as we go through my revision here on the last part of this video, but I think some of those points could have been dropped, and certainly some points needed a little bit more context before we got into them. So when she first starts talking about that dolphin example and how food aggregates and thus aggregates all the way up the food chain, that needed more time and discussion. It just got pretty dense there, and it was hard to follow. As I mentioned earlier, the big question I have at the end of this is, how is food aggregation better for survival? We know that it is, but we don't know what it is about aggregation that makes it easier for animal populations or better for animal populations. That seems to be a pretty crucial thing. I'd much rather have an answer to that than have that point in there about sound technology for studying krill. Also, an under-invention there, that popcorn analogy was good, and so good in fact that I think it would be very useful to return to that analogy at least once more in that presentation, ideally around explaining how and why aggregation is so good for those animal populations. So now let's click down to arrangement. The thing that struck me, and you've seen in the video my flow of this speech, and that was actually probably 2 or 3 times that I was trying to narrow down exactly what was going on, is there didn't seem to be a hugely logical order to the presentation. Now, I don't mean to say it was unclear or impossible to follow. It wasn't. But that if I was looking for a set of discrete points that didn't immediately jump out to me, there were a lot of sort of small points that were clustered together, aggregated. An animal could have fed well on these, but there didn't necessarily seem to be a clear logical order to the main points of the speech. As I mentioned at the outset, we spent about a minute talking about sound as a methodology in a 6-minute talk. That plus the opening bit means we're not really getting to the key portion of the talk, which is about her research in food aggregation, until a third of the way through the talk. That seems, in terms of allocating time and trying to find that balance, that seems pretty late to get to the key idea. So ultimately, and I'll come back to this now in just a second, I think in terms of arrangement, this needs simplification and prioritization. What are the key ideas? And this is a good way of talking about this at the end of week 4. Thinking in terms of what are the speech goals? And limiting those goals. If you've only got 6 minutes, there's only so much you can accomplish. And so really prioritizing what those goals are. In terms of style, for the most part, it was pretty free of jargon. Except that initial discussion of the dolphins and how they follow along with the food aggregation and how that impacts the larger food chain. In terms of delivery, she was rushed. I mean, there's no doubt there. This is a 6.5-minute talk for a pretty large research area. So she was probably going a little bit fast. Part of that is also, because of that speech, she's not really distinguishing much between the evidence and its context. That's certainly true in the second half of the speech, more so than in the first. The voice was a bit stilted. I could hear some memorization, certainly in the opening third of the speech. But overall, I would say there was still some pretty good movement and gestures. She seemed fairly comfortable. The way you'll notice these TED Talks are, they've got the screen that they're looking at on, they're standing up, so constantly she has to keep looking at the floor to see what's going to be on the screen behind her. But so that's kind of my flow, my initial notes. Now, the informative speech evaluation form here, if it's going to be useful, should be able to speak to some talk like this. Now, certainly, the TED Talk is a unique genre. They are sort of exciting topics on research ideas, but they're still informing an audience, both the audience that's physically present and then, of course, on their online presence, informing everyone about these ideas. So let's go ahead and move through this. Invention, topic, time, and audience. All right, so my key components here are balance, breadth, and depth well in discussion of the topic. Not bad. Address points appropriate for the topic and the audience. Yes, certainly, although again, why aggregation is so important was kind of lacking. I would probably put this somewhere on an adequate, maybe between adequate and good, but that's something that I wanted more of a clear logic, a clear set of key ideas. And so this was kind of an area where it needed perhaps a little bit more tweaking. Invention, in terms of evidence and explanation, appropriate and varied evidence. Oh, most certainly. We had some good analogies. We had at least 3 or 4 data sources and research studies. So I would say that's certainly a good. Maybe even a little bit higher than that, but certainly a good. Arrangement. Well, this is an area where I think that to me, the key issues in this short presentation are arrangement issues. And if arrangement gets tidied up, a lot of these other things fall into place a little bit more. So I don't know. I would probably sit this somewhere between adequate and maybe a little bit below, just in the sense that the logic isn't exactly clear. We're moving along through these various little bits and pieces, but there's not necessarily a larger narrative frame here that helps me understand what she's talking about and why she's talking about it. Style, good. I would say it is a very accessible talk up until the last minute and a half, where probably due to time constraints, she falls into a pretty jargony discussion. Once again, if you go back and look at when she's talking about that food aggregation, some of those sentences are just really long, and then the kind of sentences you would write up for publication in a scientific journal, which you wouldn't necessarily use in explaining an idea to a lay audience, which was the intended audience here. Memory and delivery, fine. Like I mentioned, I think her gestures of movement was good. Pacing and pausing was all right, a little bit fast. Was she distinguishing between key ideas and elaborating detail? Not necessarily a whole bunch. She could have appeared more confident. There's no doubt. Well, there may be some doubt about that. But that's something that struck me as she was strong, but could probably use a little bit more development there. So again, I would probably put that on adequate, somewhere between adequate and good. So that's my eval. And the last thing I want to do is kind of go through how I might revise this. Like I said, the thing that strikes me about this is the arrangement issues. So if I was making a pass on this, I would try to simplify and prioritize. So in mine, I can keep the opening pretty much the same. I'd probably maybe try to trim it down a little bit, but the opening might be the same. And then I want to maybe have 3 main points. What I research, I had this puzzle that I had in my research, and then getting to what we know, food aggregation is key to ocean survival. So what I research? Well, I'm just sort of reorganizing what she has in other places. So maybe she starts out by saying, I look at what and how animals eat, and one of the things that we've known is there's not a lot of food in the ocean. Here she can continue on with that popcorn analogy. And I study krill because krill is particularly important to ocean eating. Now, if it was really important, you could still do the point about how you study krill, that sound technology. You could do it here, but I'd say this is on that sort of 1C. That's where that would belong, and it's not the main thing we hear, right? We hear instead, here's what we're walking into your specific methodology rather than just starting with it. So what I researched, I had a puzzle. So I did like this section that she had before, those 2 maps of krill. So maybe, and that seems like an important way of getting into her research. So maybe a little bit of background on the study like she had, where it takes place in the Bering Sea. And then, start off by saying, look, kind of similar to what she has, I had a map that showed krill density but low survival. That was confusing. And I had a map that showed low krill density but high survival. And so I had this challenge. And then in this point with that key understanding, which is the answer, it seems, is food aggregation. And maybe here jump back to that popcorn analogy to explain what aggregation is and why it's so important to animal survival. And then I want to take all the studies that she has, which kind of float around in her initial model, and find some way of consolidating them. So food aggregation is key to ocean survival because it explains survival patterns that we already see. She can just briefly reference the research that she had, right? I mean, that's what those 2 studies, those 2 krill maps were showing. Aggravation can predict survival. It can predict anger. Aggregation can predict survival, kind of in the same order that she has. Once again, moving back to that sort of food density, that plant density example that she had, and then finally ending by saying, as she had with the dolphin example, animals actively aggregate to survive. So in that final point, there's a logic there. Aggregation explains, aggregation predicts, and where aggregation does not occur sufficiently for animals, they do it on their own. So, I mean, there's kind of a logic to those 3 subpoints. So that's kind of how I would take a pass at that. But certainly, I'm not a marine biologist, and if I was doing this in a cyclical pattern, maybe I would find additional research and presentation options in running this a couple of times.